Hi, everybody. My name is Isha Datar, and I'm with New Harvest. And just to give you a little bit of a background on what New Harvest is, we're advancing the post-animal bioeconomy, which is a new economy based on biotechnology where we can produce animal products without animals. And the reason why a 501c3 nonprofit is advancing this field is because it exists at this intersection of two established disciplines. On one hand, the expertise comes from medical science, but the application is in food. So we have this kind of discipline that doesn't quite fall into any category right now, and for that reason, it is severely underfunded, no matter how important this work can be. So that's why we're a nonprofit, and I thought I'd just get that out there before I start talking about this exciting new space. So let's begin by looking at the status quo. The status quo is the current animal bioeconomy, which looks a lot like this. So this is the Tascosa feed yard, and this is an aerial photo, which I actually think you can look at from Google Maps. And all those brown squares are feedlots, and within each one of those brown squares is probably a few hundred cattle, or maybe 100 cattle. And what comes off of all those cattle is runoff, because they're producing so much manure that it runs off into this big lagoon where it collects. And because this manure is such a great fertilizer, it causes algae to bloom very quickly. So when we think about animal agriculture, I think we all like to think that the meat that we're purchasing, or any animal product that we're purchasing, comes from animals that are grown on a field, and their fertilizer, replenishes the soil, and then we can grow plants from that. But in fact, the scale that we're producing animals right now is such that it's no longer cyclical, it's rather inputs and outputs. And those inputs are corn and soy, and the outputs, for one, is water pollution. So the entire Gulf of Mexico is a giant dead zone because of these algal blooms, and that's because of all the upstream runoff coming off into the Mississippi River from all the animal production farms up there. So this is what animal farming looks like today. And this is what the impact of it looks like. So today, 1/3 of all ice-free land is dedicated to livestock production, which sounds very ridiculous. But if we think about just the land that is fit for agriculture, 70% of that is used for growing gigantic crops, corn and soy, to feed to animals. And that's an extremely inefficient way for us to be using our land. Further, about 8% of the global water supply is used for animal agriculture, which is a huge amount, and that fresh water is an even higher percentage than that. And then when we think about climate change and how much animal agriculture affects that, well, 18% of all greenhouse gas emissions come from livestock production. And that is significant because it's a higher estimate than all greenhouse gas emissions from world transportation. So when we're thinking about what's affecting climate change the most, I think that animal agriculture should be at the top of the list. Oops. Another thing about that is when we are thinking about the greenhouse gas emissions of animal production, we might think, well, maybe if we eat local, we can minimize that because the animals are nearby us, and so they will require less carbon dioxide to be emitted in transportation. But actually, a lot of that, the vast majority of the greenhouse gas emissions come from the actual production and raising of animals. And then there's other threats above how it affects ecology. So antibiotic resistance is one of our most serious health threats, and the CDC said in 2013 that animal agriculture is the primary contributor to that. So when we think about, this graph shows how antibiotics are used in the United States right now. 80% of all antibiotics are given to animals, not to humans. And those are the exact same drugs that we use. So when we think about how horrible it will be when our antibiotics don't work anymore, it's because we're using them for animals in this kind of prophylactic, preventative way, and not actually to treat animals that have bacterial infections. Another thing is when you have animals so closely packed together, you have the perfect scenario for creating disease. So say these chickens, for example. When you have chickens close together, you have a virus that can move from one chicken to another. It mutates every time it moves from one chicken to another, and eventually mutates into a form that can affect humans. This is how the avian flu started, or the swine flu, and it's how our next epidemics are going to arise. It's not really a question of if, it's just a question of when. I'm sorry, the clicker is, it's actually me. So here's an example of how the avian flu spread. Or actually, no, this is swine flu, H1N1. This was just over a matter of months, and it spread all over the world. And as we become a more connected world, the ability for these gigantic epidemics to affect the whole world are even more scary than they ever were before. And this is all, in the lens of our global demand for meat increasing. And I've heard many times people talking about, well, in North America, meat consumption is leveling off or decreasing, or red meat consumption is going down, but we really need to be thinking about this as a global problem, because it doesn't matter who's eating meat and where they're eating meat. It's a global issue, and it affects our whole planet. So I like looking at the current trajectory of animal production right now, because I think it's a very interesting contrast to what I'm proposing with this post-animal bioeconomy. So this is some research that happened at the university I went to, the University of Alberta, where they keep a lot of heritage birds. And on the left there is a chicken from 1950, which looks a lot like a pigeon or a crow or a bird that we would see in the wild. And beside that is a chicken from 2008, and it is much younger than the chicken from 1950, but you can see it's grown so quickly in such a short amount of time. And you'll also note that this North American 2008 chicken has enormous breasts, and that's because chicken breasts have been what drives the demand for chicken. So there's problems that come with raising chickens this way. For one thing, a lot of animal advocates would say that chickens like this suffer because they're growing so quickly that they actually can't accommodate their own mass, and it's hard on their legs and things like that. The other thing is when you grow chickens this quickly, they are metabolizing so quickly that they are prone to overheating. So now you have to think about costs in how to cool these chickens down. And one technological solution to cooling chickens down is the next very shocking picture, which is a chicken that is bred to not have feathers. And I want to point out that this featherless chicken, as well as the chicken from 2008, those are not created through invasive genetic modification techniques. Those are just choosing which two chickens to breed with one another. It's selective breeding. It's something that we do, in everything else. It's not, test tubes and needles or anything like that. So the featherless chicken was proposed as an idea to keep these chickens much cooler, and so we wouldn't have to pay so much to heat for them, and it's a climate change solution, things like that. But of course, when you don't have feathers, now you're prone to insect bites, and this and that and the other thing that comes when you don't have a protective layer. So my question is, how far are we going to go with modifying an animal? And the two other circles are not, they don't exist. They were speculative design projects, but I think they illustrate an interesting point. The one on the far right is the idea of putting chickens in like virtual reality helmets so that they don't feel like they're not aware of how horrible their scenario is. I think it's funny because in this picture, the chicken looks like it's in a pretty nice place, but that was one idea. The other idea was this center of unconscious farming, where you have chickens that don't feel pain. They've been modified in some way to not feel pain, and they're in these like giant racks where they're just fed nutrients. And in that way, I find it interesting because that really shows that we use chickens as bioreactors. We use their bodies as a vessel for growing meat. And sorry, this image is a continuation of that Center for Unconscious Farming. It's kind of matrixy, which is why I like showing it. But yes, this is how we're treating animals essentially today, because this is what goes on today. We have chickens that are just in this kind of very mechanized system that we've created, and this is where most of our chicken comes from, and most of our animal products come from. So let's talk about a different trajectory, and that is one where instead of growing a whole complex organism and making it wear a VR helmet or or currently cutting its beak off so it doesn't peck the chickens around it, pulling its feathers out, taking off the skin, especially when we're what's pushing this drive is a skinless, boneless, fat-trimmed chicken breast. Why not just produce that chicken breast from the basic unit of life, which is the cell, into a tissue rather than a whole organism, and then cut everything away to make this tissue? If that's what we want, why not do it this way? So this is how we would produce tissue animal products, but I also wanted to talk about other animal products. The non-tissue animal products. So the tissue ones are like leather and meat, where you actually have to consume a piece of the animal. But a non-tissue animal product is like milk or eggs. So this diagram shows, well, we could milk. That protein in the middle is supposed to be casein, but I don't actually know if it is because I found it on the internet. But we raise these female cows, we take away we artificially inseminate them, take away the calves, and collect milk from them. And milk is just a simple mixture of proteins and fats. Why do we need to go through this whole system of raising animals to collect these proteins and fats when we can use much more efficient systems to do that, like yeast? We've been using yeast to make proteins and fats for a long time. So this is how we're proposing to produce non-tissue animal products. And we've actually, We've done this before. So I guess the first two products that we created to replace animal products are insulin and rennet. So insulin used to be made from the pancreases of pigs and cattle, which we'd collect from animals, grind up, and then have to isolate the insulin proteins from them. And of course, that had to be a very pure mixture because we weren't giving this to people to ingest. We were injecting it into their bodies. So it had to be very pure. And of course, the problem with that is, A, you need a steady supply of pig and cattle pancreases, and B, you need to make sure that that supply is very pure, very consistent from batch to batch, because you're giving it to patients at a certain dose. So in about 1978, this guy, Herbert Boyer, who's with Genentech, created insulin, but now it was the actual human insulin protein, where he inserted the insulin gene into E. coli, and now E. coli makes human insulin, and that's how most insulin is made around the world today. And the reason why that insulin is so great is because it is human insulin, it's not animal insulin, and it's pure, and it's a more stable supply, it's a more consistent supply, and it can be relied upon much more than insulin from pancreases. And then for a food example, rennet. So rennet is a collection of enzymes in the fourth stomach of a calf, and it's used to turn milk into curds and whey for cheese making. And we used to collect rennet from this stomach of the calf and grind it up in the same way and have to purify this protein out of it. But in 1990, the very first genetically modified product for food was approved, and that was microbial rennet made in a microbe, where they create chymosin, which is the most active enzyme, in yeast. And what's so amazing about that is the exact same thing. So you have a stable supply, you have a consistent supply, and you have a product that will behave exactly the same way every single time. So we can see what the benefits are to producing these products outside of animals and instead using more predictable systems like yeast or other microbes. And this is a good time for me to just talk about the whole history of biotechnology, but very, very short, in a short way. Biotech began with food. So it began when we started fermenting things, which is when we started introducing cell cultures to our food. So I like pointing out that before biotechnology, we had milk. After biotechnology, we had yogurt and kefir and however many different types of cheeses. And so biotechnology opened up this whole world of food that we didn't have before. After fermentation, we continued into this kind of selective breeding and moving into different ways to produce foods. There's corn, and the tiny little seed thing beside it is teosinte, which is what corn came from. As you can see, teosinte is not of much use to us. It doesn't offer much nutritional benefit to us, and it's not much of a food-producing crop. But with biotechnology, we were able to turn that into corn over many, many years. And then biotech transitioned into producing drugs like the insulin that I mentioned earlier, and more recently it's gotten into energy. But I think the next step is coming back to food again, but in a different way. So I think the big question is, where are we today? And this is my favorite slide to show. So these are the prototypes of animal-free foods, which are, they're not alternatives to animal foods, they are animal foods. They behave in exactly the same way, except they were made without animals. So that is milk that started as the New Harvest Dairy Project, but became its own company called Moo-Free. That milk was made with yeast, which had caseins and whey in the yeast, and then the caseins and whey came out, and we mixed it together, and it became this milk. And unlike nut milks or unlike other alternatives, this milk can behave like milk from the store. It will become yogurt, it will become cheese, and it will become, a cheese that is perhaps better than the vegan cheeses that are out there right now. And then there is a meringue, which is made from the New Harvest Egg Project, which became Clara Foods, another company that kind of spun out of New Harvest. Egg replacements right now are plant-based, but for some reason we can't figure out a combination of plants that allows us to use it as an egg in every single application. So the plant protein portfolio that you would use to make a meringue would be different from the one that we'd use to make a sauce or a cake. But these proteins are the exact same ovalbumins and a couple other proteins. So we can make meringues, but we could also make a scrambled egg, all those great things. And then below that is the cell-cultured hamburger, which was tasted in August of 2013. New Harvest helped get that project started, but it was heavily funded by Sergey Brin from Google. And that burger, I don't know if anyone here has watched that tasting, but the person who tasted it said it was definitely not a veggie burger. So I'm sure we still have a long way to go, because that burger was made only with muscle cells. There was no fat involved, there was no connective tissue, and those all add to the taste and texture of meat. But it was a very exciting and important first prototype in terms of advancing the field of meat produced in culture. And then I like showing these products because it shows that, animal products extend far beyond farmed animal products. In a way, New Harvest work actually addresses issues of conservation. So here's a rhino horn that was made in culture. And we work with a team called Pembient, which is making rhino horn because they think if they can flood the market with this equivalent rhino horn, then there will be no need to harvest rhino horns from rhinos. It's a little bit more controversial than cultured meat in my opinion, but I think it's definitely worth exploring. Beside that is our silk fibers that are not made from spiders, they're made from yeast as well. And below that is a leather made by Modern Meadow, which was presented at TED Global, I think in 2013. And for me, leather is very, very exciting because people are excited about materials, they're excited about fashion, and when you're growing something with such a level of control as you would in cell culture, as opposed to raising animals, you can produce leather products like you could never produce before. So for example, this piece of leather, I think was 7 cell layers thick. And Andras also has a piece of leather which is 21 layers thick. So you can produce leathers that are translucent, you can produce leathers that have this certain texture and thickness, and you can probably introduce all kinds of other properties that couldn't exist before in leather. So we're opening, just how I said before, how before fermentation we didn't have cheese and all these different types of cheese. I'm excited to see what we can do with this new field in terms of unleashing all these new products and new types of food. So here's a very, very basic rundown of how you would produce cultured meat in particular. And this image is from a publication from 2004, which was pretty much the first modern investigation into cultured meat, and it was written by the founder of New Harvest. His name is Jason. So what you do is you have to start with a cell culture, so you get a sample of cells from somewhere. If you're growing meat, that means you're going to collect muscle cells from either an animal or from maybe a cell culture that has already been kept frozen. So some people ask me, how many times will you have to go back to the animal to collect cells? Well, I guess that depends on the system that we're creating. If it's very, very important that we only collect cells once, I'm sure we could do it. But if we are looking to introduce variety into our cultured meat world, perhaps farms change, and instead of having this monoculture, single type of animal farm, you have all these heritage meats and this kind of introduced biodiversity, which allows us to collect different kinds of cells because it would grow different kinds of meat. But as far as collecting cells goes, it's a simple biopsy. You can anesthetize the animal and collect a little bit, and that's it. You don't have to slaughter anything. So say we have muscle cells. Muscle cells are unlike microbes in that they need to attach onto a surface. So we need to provide them a scaffold, which is some kind of biomaterial which allows these muscle cells to adhere, because they need to adhere in order to divide and mature. So that scaffold could be, there's a huge variety of what that scaffold could be. One proposed idea was chitin, which is what shrimp shells are made of. Another idea is to make it of some kind of collagen plasticky material, and then you could remove it from that. Other people have proposed making it the scaffold of another edible material so that it kind of adds to the texture of the meat. There's almost infinite possibilities for what the scaffold could be. And then you have to put the cells growing on the scaffold into a nutrient medium, which is what is feeding the cells. So I guess the biggest question with cultured meat right now is, how are you going to feed cells when the status quo for feeding mammalian cells right now is a fetal bovine serum, which comes from animals? And it doesn't seem to make much sense that we would be trying to produce an animal-free animal product that requires the use of an animal product. The thing is that the only reason why the norm for growing cells in fetal bovine serum is because it works really, really well, and we don't really know why. And you can imagine it's because a growing fetus requires all these different kinds of nutrients, so it's a very rich nutrient broth, and it's, in a way, it makes sense that cells grow that way, but people don't really understand what the mechanisms behind it are. But I believe that we can work towards producing media without this serum, and in fact, that cultured hamburger that I showed you before, towards the second half of producing that burger, they were able to do it with an animal-free media. So I think it's something that we can work around. It's just in the current research, there hasn't been the pressure to work around that before, until now. So the fourth element, of course, would be the bioreactor, which is, I guess, like the body that all this takes place in. And it's controlled temperature, there's inputs and outputs. And when I give the visual image of what a bioreactor should look like, I tell people to think of a beer brewery or a beer brewery, because it's a gigantic stainless steel tank and it's a controlled temperature, but we don't see the people who run them as mad scientists, we see them as artisans and craftspeople. Then another issue that comes up, I'm trying to preempt all your questions so we can move on to really good questions. So one of the questions is, how could cultured meat ever be cost effective? And I mean, we don't know that for sure, but the price of cultured meat, so that hamburger, it cost $300,000 to produce that single hamburger, which sounds so absurd. But how much did the first computer cost to make? Or how much did the first, to bring any kind of drug to market cost $1 billion? I mean, that's cheap. That's like a good price for the very first. So the price of cultured meat can only come down, and that's because we'll optimize our process, we'll be innovating in new types of machinery that's specialized for producing cultured meat, and we're also going to be producing it at scale. That burger was so expensive because we were doing it at lab scale, which is like tiny, tiny bits of tissue and repeating that experiment over and over and over again. And that cost also factors in paying a PhD technician to be running that experiment for 2 years. So that's not effective. And then coupled with this price of cultured meat coming down, we have to think about what the price of conventional meat is going to do. And I think that the price of conventional meat can only go up with time because our population growth is going up, and so the demand is going up, and so you saw how much land we have left for producing meat. It's not that much. So we have to be making more meat with less, which is very, very difficult to do. Another thing that I think will come up is diminishing subsidies and support from government, but that's a little bit, that's a guess. Another thing that will increase the price of meat are these unforeseen circumstances that cause the price to go up. So for example, in around April of this year, there was the avian flu, which resulted in 50 million chickens having to be culled in the Midwest. And I don't know how much that was like popular, in the news and people knew about it, but when all those chickens had to be culled, which of course is very bad business, the price of eggs went up 130%. So as more and more of these disease-oriented events take place, the less and less it is that producing animals is a good business plan, and the price, of course, goes up with that. So I think the price of cultured meat can only come down. I want to point out that where the cross in the price exists on this graph is just a guess. I don't know when it's going to happen. Another question that comes up a lot is, are we trying to replace all animal products and then we'll never see a cow again, and what happens to all the cows? But I don't think that's a good way of thinking about cultured meat. I think we need to think about it as introducing diversity into our portfolio of meat products. And I think energy is a great example, parallel. So before, a lot of our energy came from coal, and coal is like dirty and dangerous, and it's just the worst. And from that, we started to think, okay, what are the other sources of energy? Solar, wind, nuclear, other renewable sources. And today we still use coal, and we still use these kind of less preferred forms of energy, but it's decreased now because we have these other forms. And also having these other forms mean we have this kind of resilient system such that if we have some event that shows that one form is not suitable in a certain situation, or in one environment one form is not good, we have this kind of portfolio to pull from. And I like to think of factory farming as like the coal power of meat production. It's intensive, and it's ugly, and it's dirty, and it's not great. But if we start exploring how to diversify our portfolio of meat, maybe it means plant-based alternatives, maybe it means cultured meat, maybe it means more of these small-scale farms. We have a more resilient system such that when something like a big avian flu wipes out what's going on in factory farms, we have these other systems to compensate for it. And in a way, it makes for a lot safer system as well. And since we're at the Eco South by Southwest, I wanted to show you what the environmental impacts of cultured meat might look like. This was from a study that was done in 2011, and I have to point out it's very speculative because it's looking at the environmental impact of something that doesn't exist yet, so keep that in mind. But as you can imagine, cultured meat will require far fewer inputs because we're not raising whole animals with hide and horns and et cetera to produce these very simple, relatively simple products. So we suspect that the energy use of cultured meat will be only 55% that of conventional meat. It'll only produce 4% of the greenhouse gas emissions, require 1% of land because we can go vertically now. We don't need to use these large swaths of deforested Amazon to grow soy, and require only 4% of the water. And I'm going to kind of sum up this presentation with visions of the future. And I like this word that came up in 2011, carnery. So beer is grown in, I guess it's grown. Beer is produced in a brewery, bread in a bakery, wine from a winery. Where does meat come from? A carnery. I thought that was a really interesting idea. So what does a carnery look like? Well, I like showing this image of the Brooklyn Brewery. So think about where meat is produced right now. You definitely cannot go on a tour through there. And there's very little transparency as to what goes on in a factory farm. But if meat was produced in this way, you have this controlled environment where the person who is working on it is perceived as an artisan. He is a scientist. He had to get a PhD in some kind of biology, microbiology, to do this. And meat production is happening in this very sterile environment. It's very clean, it's very safe, and in some ways very educational. And aside from these kind of large breweries that exist maybe in rural areas, you also have the idea of like brew pubs, where you could be producing a house meat or local meat in a specific restaurant setting, and we actually like sitting in the presence of this very highly technical gear, which is awesome. And then there's also the idea of the home brewing apparatus. I just bought a bread machine, and I love the fact that I can take these like shelf-stable ingredients like flour and yeast and stick it in there and time it, and then the next morning I have an amazing, beautiful loaf of bread. And I would love to see something like that happen for cultured meat. You go to the store, you buy like a cell culture, a vial of culture, or you go and in your freezer, maybe you have a sample of cells and you load it up into your machine, and then the next morning you have, sausage or something. I mean, this is way out, but I think it's important to think about what this actually looks like, because when people think about lab-grown or in vitro, those words conjure up, needles and like this hospital setting stuff, but it's not like that. We've been using biotechnology in food for so long, and it looks like this. I mean, beer brewing is biotechnology. So I think this is my last slide, where I show, we thought about the bread machine of meat. This is where the science stands right now. So these were the culture plates that were used to produce that hamburger. And the reality is the number of people working on cultured meat and these food products is like less than 20 people, which seems outrageous, especially considering how impactful it could be and how much safer it could be and how much of a better system it could be. So New Harvest's work is really about populating this field with as many researchers, with as many people asking the questions about how to make this happen and figuring out what the best ways are to make this happen. And that's what we do. So don't get ahead of yourself. This is where we are right now. If you want to support this, you can always get involved. We'll open it up for questions.
Thank you so much. How should we live while we wait for the post-animal bioeconomy?
That's a great question. I think this is the non-intrusive way to ask, should we all be vegan? So I think it's important to acknowledge that eating less animal products is like the easiest thing that we can do to eat more sustainably. So you can consider that. On the other hand, the message of vegetarianism has been around for thousands of years. And when I got into this field, so my background is in cell molecular biology, and I took a meat science course because I saw a poster for it, like at school. So I took this, and then it completely changed my idea about environmentalism. And I learned that meat production and animal production was like, they're terrible, and they have such a good reputation for some reason. And I thought, okay, well, we should all be vegetarian, obviously. But that has been around for such a long time, and we haven't seen it take off in any kind of meaningful way for over the thousands of years that it's been a message, that I think it's very important for us to think about, what's next. How are we going to be eating in 50 years or 100 years, and work backwards? So yes, in the meanwhile, if you want to eat as sustainably as you can eat less animal products or try to eat less animal products. But hopefully we can eat meat that's made in culture.
Great. And what about insect protein? They use a fraction of energy, water, and space requirements of animal protein. And I guess bugs like crawling on each other.
So I guess what about insect protein? I mean, it's also been around for thousands of years. I don't know how many people here have eaten insects recently, even though they're all over the place. I think it's an awesome solution, and people should get into it more. I just think I don't know, maybe I'll ask the audience, would you rather eat cultured meat or insects? I mean, that's very mixed, which is cool, very cool. I mean, I guess insects can be in our diversified meat portfolio.
Good answer. Are there any health or nutritional downsides of animal products without animals?
I mean, we don't know because those animal products don't exist yet. So that's why we're trying to populate this research field so we can be asking these important questions. And part of the reason why I got into this is because I thought, well, it's going to happen anyway, and I have a vision for how I want this to be done responsibly. So I thought, well, I might as well get into it because I want it to be designed in this way. So, I mean, the answer is we don't know, and it'll have to go through a bunch of testing and regulatory procedures to find that out. But I mean, in theory, I don't see why it would be different in the same way we produce these rennet and insulin and all these other products in culture. A lot of our food ingredients come from the same kind of systems. So I think it would be okay. Also, a lot of this tissue engineering that contributes to producing cultured meat comes from the world of medicine, where you're growing organs for organ transplantation, or you're growing skin from burn victims. The requirements of those tissues are much higher than the requirements of something that you would have to ingest, because that tissue has to function, that tissue has to be totally sterile and actually operate within the environments of an existing living tissue. So I think if we can achieve those things in medicine, that what we would do for the food application is actually relatively easy.
Great. There would be a lot of policy implications here. So have you thought about how to tackle the lobbies for corn and beef? I don't want to make it seem like we're tackling the animal ag industry, because I think it's fair to point out that if animal agriculture got into this, it would probably be more come to market quicker and probably have a greater impact. So instead of thinking of big ag as an opposition, I think when we speak to them, we point out that animals are the source of a lot of their problems. And for anyone who's worked in animal ag or in any kind of ag, the elephant in the room is a cow or a pig or a chicken. It's the fact that the source of all instability in your supply chain is the animal. The source of these diseases, all of your costs, they go into the fact that you have to produce things with an animal. So I think instead of thinking of them as an opposition, there's potential cooperation that could happen there. How much of the meat consumption is being driven by advertising and the availability of cheap food, fast food?
I think meat consumption is driven by cost, and cost is so low because of agricultural subsidies. And some of the most heavily subsidized crops are corn and soy. And if you think how subsidized that is, that subsidy effect is multiplied because animals consume so much corn and so much soy. So cost is definitely a reason why meat consumption has gone up. And I don't know why that system is like that. It's so complex that when I ask ag people about it, even they're like, I don't know how it happened that way. I'm sure someone here has an answer.
So in a related question, are you seeing any pushback from them when you have those conversations with agriculture industry now?
We've been getting, mixed reactions. On one hand, there are ranchers and ag people who approach us saying, this is so exciting. We can be producing things in a way that's, more stable and more consistent. And we're having, these early conversations about people from the ag industry getting excited about this. On the other hand, every once in a while, there'll be a publication in like a meat industry magazine talking about how cultured meat is so silly and stupid. But, they're actually very humorous articles. One of them concluded with, guess what, vegetarians? It's still meat. And I was like, that's a great thing. That's an awesome thing. But
Okay, this is a tough one. What would the ethics of culturing human meat for human consumption be?
That's a good question. I gave a lecture at Columbia recently, and one of the students said, in a way, cultured meat is a way to introduce meat with consent. Because now, if you wanted to consume meat that you wanted to be consumed, you could donate your own tissues. I don't know what the ethics would be of culturing human meat. I mean, we're not really thinking about that. But all the medical stuff, that's all human tissue. Like we're doing that first. And we probably, if we wanted to produce cultured human meat, we could probably do that much more easily than the agricultural animal meat because we already know so much about human cells. But ethically, I don't know. That's for you guys to decide. I'm not sure.
Have you tasted any of the products that you've shown, and how are they?
Oh, I tasted the cultured milk, but that was like version 1, and it was not that good. But that's because, I think I'm not worried about that one. It wasn't pictured here, but I tasted cultured meat made by Modern Meadow in the form of a steak chip. So again, talking about all these like new possibilities for food, cell cultures grow only 0.5 millimeters thick if they're not exposed to vasculature that brings nutrients into the tissue. So we have such thick tissue because we have veins and arteries bringing nutrients up into our muscles. But if you're growing it in culture and you don't have those veins, you grow these very, very thin sheets. So Modern Meadow grew this very thin sheet of muscle tissue and then dried it, and then I tasted it. And it had the exact same mouth feel as a potato chip, but it was like 80% protein, and it tasted kind of like French onion soup broth, like beef bouillon. It was good. It's like a fitness chip.
Awesome. Will we be able to make meat and byproducts from animals that are extinct? So dinosaur meat, woolly mammoths, is that on the menu?
Aurochs are what cows, what cows originated as, which is a cool idea. I don't know, do we have living tissue from any of these things? Sure. I mean, if we can get to the point where we can create, a viable muscle cell from many things, I don't see why not. But another thing to point out is that once you figure out how to produce cultured beef, it's not exactly the same as producing cultured chicken, because a mammalian cell or a cow cell does not behave the same way as a chicken cell does, and in the same way, a human cell, even though we know so much about humans, it doesn't translate into us knowing a lot about how cow tissue will behave. So yes, technically we could do all those things, but that's like way in the exciting future, I guess.
South by Southwest Eco 2050 welcome dinner.
Yeah.
Love it there. Even with the technologically produced meat, are there still risks for disease breakouts and contamination?
So if anyone has worked in a beer brewery before, every once in a while you have a bad batch where some fungus will get in there, or some contamination happens, and you have to clean out all your machinery and start again because you have this kind of living system. So it is very possible that in growing cultured meat or any kind of other cell culture product, you will also have something like that because it's living tissue, and everything we eat is living, and you're always prone to these kind of contaminated things, whether it's bugs on your vegetables or bacteria or viruses. So I guess there is that risk of breakout, but it's not nearly as unpredictable or hard to control as it is with animals today. That avian flu I was telling you about earlier, where they had to cull 50 million chickens, the biggest problem with that flu was that they couldn't figure out how to get rid of the chickens fast enough. So, that doesn't happen when you have this kind of closed environment where if you have a contamination, it's still in a closed environment and you have a procedure for cleaning it out. It doesn't have this capacity to escape and, affect a bunch of other organisms.
Popular question, are you vegan?
I'm not vegan, but I wish I think I think being vegan is a very great thing, and I think it's a very mindful thing to do and very sustainable. But especially because I'm tasting all these animal products, it's important for me to be like, no, this sucks. We need to keep going with the milk. We need to keep going with the meat, and so meat and milk and eggs are all part of my diet still. I don't eat them nearly as much as I would like, but yeah.
Such an important idea, and we really appreciate your sense of humor. But how will you get the public past the ick factor? How will you communicate the story to the public?
That's a great question. And it's something that comes up over and over and over again. And when you try and tease apart what the ick factor is, I think people start by saying technology and food, the ick factor is in technology. But I don't think the ick factor is in technology. I think the ick factor is in newness. Because, I mean, this is an extreme example, but in vitro fertilization, do people think that children grown through in vitro fertilization are lesser or icky or gross? No. And we've become used to that because we see that, okay, it's just technology used to help us, and that the net benefits are so much more than the negatives. And so when we're getting past the ick factor, I think it's important, that we have this conversation. It's a public conversation, and that's why I love that New Harvest is a nonprofit, and we're out there talking about these technologies and showing early stage prototypes, because if we were a big corporation, that wouldn't happen, and we wouldn't be seeing this, and we wouldn't know what's going on. And that conversation is so important when it comes to guiding how we want this to look. What can we do to make it less icky? What's okay to us? What's not okay to us? This conversation is what's very, very important. And compared to GMOs, the first GMO was approved for sale in 1992, the GMO plant, not the rennet. And then our first actual organized right to know campaign was 2002. So 10 years had passed where we were consuming a product where no one was asking questions and we weren't getting much in terms of answers. By contrast, we are talking about cultured food products that were probably 10 years away, and we're having this conversation 10 years early. And I think that is so important in terms of bringing transparency to food and, in a sense, democracy to food, because we're all able to participate.
Lab meat seems like a mid-upper class luxury right now, even as prices come down. Will the benefits trickle down?
Yeah, it's totally luxury. I mean, I can't even afford a $300,000 burger, but it will have to come down over time, and there's not really anything that we could do to bring that price down. I think one thing that could totally bring the price down is if cultured meat was as subsidized as meat is today. That would be a really interesting way to bring it down. Or at least subsidize the research, so a tiny team like us don't have to do it. How will the benefits trickle down? Well, I think it will just be better for everyone. If you have all these environmental benefits, if you're not prone to disease, disease is very difficult for people who do not have, the financial capability to overcome it and deal with it. I don't think the benefits actually affect the upper middle class only. I think by the upper middle class maybe consuming it and helping to bring the price down, the benefits affect the whole world.
How do you justify this investment for a solution of meat distribution where there are equally or bigger human challenges at the forefront of today's problems? And do you agree that there are bigger challenges?
Yes, there are lots of important, gigantic human challenges in the world today. My degree can't help with all of them. So I chose this because I thought it was something very impactful that I could do. I don't know how you would say what the most important problem is. I just think this one is a very important problem, and I also think it's compelling how, for a nonprofit, we're not as focused on the problem as we are on solutions. I think is a very exciting approach. And justifying this investment, to give you an idea of the investment of these things, in New Harvest, our budget last year was $60,000. And with that we hustled a lot to move external funds from existing pools of money and philanthropists to move money to this area. We're not like a multi-million-dollar nonprofit, even though I think that would be cool and we would do a lot of good work with it. This is not a gigantic investment. And what we're trying to do with New Harvest work is inspire investment. So, okay, think about R&D in the meat industry right now. What are they? I don't know what they're doing. So I've read about I've read about some of their experiments to deal with climate change. It's things like how hot can a pig get before it is, not producing meat? It's R&D that is very questionable to me, and it seems so obvious that this is the kind of R&D that you would do as part of, ag, because it's a risk mitigation strategy, and it's also so important just to figure out, to look at. It's worth investigating, even if in the end we decide culture meat was not a good idea. At least we looked into it. So what I would like to do is slowly inspire the established funding organizations, build this kind of critical mass of researchers such that when we go to the NSF or we go to the USDA and say, cellular agriculture is the future, these are all the benefits that come out of it. There's already a scientific community ready and willing to be mobilized. Maybe we can inspire the NSF, the National Science Foundation, to create their own $5 million fund per year, or use the existing channels for research funding to focus in this area, because it's so underfunded, and I have no idea why. And I think this investment is worthwhile, and I don't know if this is the biggest human challenges, but we can definitely divert money from the far, far lesser human challenges to this work.
The augmented reality for chickens is so cute, though. Okay, so would we still be able to cook or prepare meals in the same way? And would you be able to purchase pre-made foods like frozen meals?
The idea is that that the experience of meat will be as close to the same as possible. So you would go to the meat fridge. Maybe conventional meat is still there beside it, and you just purchase it and you cook it in exactly the same way. I don't think it would need to be frozen, because also, all of our foodborne illness comes from the fact that we collect meat from animals and we open up their gut, and that's where all the E. coli and whatever is. Because there's no gut, the shelf life should be longer. It should be safer. We shouldn't have to bleach everything when we cook it at home. So, yeah, it should be exactly the same.
Okay, great. I think that's all we have time for today, but thank you so much. This was
Thank
great.
you. That was fun.